stage of an electric car is complicated. Figuring out where all the wires go, making sure that everything's neatly arranged and so on. So when you think it looks complicated, understand design and development is complicated. Ambition remains coming up with clarity, consistency, a common language for comparison, and so on. Like, hopefully it'll work like an electric car. We'll get in, press the button and drive off. A little bit of navigation of the steering wheel. So that's where we're going. But today, to talk about this, I'm very pleased to be able to have Nadia Humphreys, who's Sustainable Finance Manager, Head, Grand Poobah and Guru at Bloomberg, who is also the co-rapporteur of the Usability and Data Working Group of the EU platform, of which I have the privilege to be a member, serving under Nadia's guidance. And we also have Isabelle Lambert from SPIE. She's the Corporate Social Responsibility Director. SPIE is a major French engineering firm who've been really looking at the taxonomy and its application to tell her story. We want to get to nuts and bolts here. This webinar is being broadcast live on YouTube. You can certainly find it there, and you will be able to find the recording of the webinar immediately afterwards if you search for EU taxonomy, climate bonds, or the name of the taxonomy you see on the screen now. If you want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function on your screen. We will attempt to answer key questions. We will otherwise collect them, and I'll spend Sunday night answering them by email, text, just so you know. We'll do our best. But the main part of this is a conversation about how we go. So Nadia, I'm actually going to ask you now to give us the introductory comments, your overview. What does this mean for corporations, this fantastic beast we've created, the European Union taxonomy on sustainable finance?
Thanks, Sean, as ever, a really incredible introduction. I love the electric car analogy. I personally can't wait to be able to press the start button and it to seemingly smoothly kind of glide off. We're not quite there yet, I think that's fair to say. And the other thing I want to recognise is we know at this point in time there is confusion in the market around what is sustainable. And hopefully the taxonomy is going to solve that problem by providing just a simple list of activities that are aligned to the EU regime. So I'm going to take you through a couple of steps, if that's all right, Sean, just to explain to people what is the taxonomy at a very basic level. Hopefully not take too much time, because I'm sure people are more interested in what Isabel has to say than what I do, having gone through it herself. So starting in the summer of last year, the taxonomy regulation was published in the official journal, and it was published for two environmental objectives. So one is mitigation, that's the impact you have on the environment. And then the second is adaptation, which is the impact that the environment potentially has on you and your operations. The Commission is currently preparing a delegated act for the remaining 4 environmental objectives you'll see on the other side of this screen. And we're expecting that to be published around the end of the year. So there is still more to come. In terms of the next slide, so what do you have to do within the EU taxonomy? What does it actually mean to be taxonomy aligned? Well, if we could move to the next, thank you, Sean. So really what you have to do is the taxonomy defines for a set of activities what it takes to substantially contribute to one of those environmental objectives. At the moment, as I've mentioned, it's mitigation or adaptation. Do no significant harm to any other environmental objective. And at the start, you heard me say, well, there are still 4 pending, but actually from a do no significant harm perspective, the taxonomy is complete and it has requirements across all 6. And then finally, at an entity level, you need to verify that you're in compliance with minimum social safeguards. And maybe over the course of the conversation, we'll come on to a little bit of what that actually means in practice. Another thing I know we're going to be talking about a little later on is what does the taxonomy cover? And Sean, if you wouldn't mind just to the next slide. So what we've got here is what the taxonomy is scoped to cover today. And the very first reporting requirement will be that you understand what portion of your business is eligible to the taxonomy. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, it means that you have technical screening criteria or testing criteria within the taxonomy. So at the moment, for example, you won't find pharmaceuticals or fashion and apparel within the taxonomy in the current delegated acts. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't sustainable actors in those sectors. It just means that at the moment they're not covered. And so the technical screening criteria really focused on the scope 1 or direct emissions that are generated in the EU and prioritize sectors there. Now, Sean mentioned that he and I sit on the platform. It is our role with an extended peer group to grow that, to start to look at additional sectors that could be eligible and additional criteria that could be eligible for those sectors. So at the moment, this is very much a starting place for the taxonomy, but that's why eligibility is a really important piece of information for you to give. Is what I'm doing covered? And I'm sure Isabel will come to this in kind of practical terms later as well. If what you're doing is covered, you then need to do a set of tests that will demonstrate substantial contribution. I've got a little worked example here, and I'll talk you through it in terms of how you could just conceptually think about reporting. So in the next slide, imagine this fictional company. So you are company XYZ, and let's imagine, for sake of argument, and people who know me know that I love a cement example. So I am a cement manufacturer and I make cement out of factories A, B, C, and D. Currently, only factory A is meeting these technical screening criteria. So in the case of cement, what does that actually mean? So I need to be, for mitigation, operating within the EU emissions trading system, EU ETS. So I need to have the carbon intensity, so my scope 1 carbon divided by the ton of cement I make within each plant recorded. And then for the proportion of revenue attributed to, for example, plant A, that is going to be my share of activities, or the very first reporting KPI, which would be my turnover. So that 20% is my first year. Now let's imagine that, and I think maybe this has some animation on it, Sean. I'm kind of waiting for a little bit of red text, so maybe that'll pop up next.
Oh
Brilliant.
my God, it does too. That's exciting, Nadia. I had no idea.
To be honest with you, I didn't either. So this is news to both of us. Okay, so let's imagine that company XYZ decide to update plant B. So they invest. There's capital expenditure associated to improving the performance of plant B. And over 5 years, they're successful. And A and B are now both operating within the EU ETS thresholds. And 50% of the company's revenue or turnover is now associated to cement coming from plants A and B. So therefore, the company can start to report not only its turnover, but also the capital expenditure associated with it. Let's continue on. So C isn't really producing much, and we decide to make a view that we're going to build a new plant, plant E, and decommission plant C. And as a result of that, again, capital expenditure. So the proportion of my capital expenditure going to making plant E and constructing it to be in line with the EU ETS thresholds, and at the moment with the 5-year maturity, means that I can report both my capital expenditure and then in conclusion, by 2030, my plants A, B, and E are all going to be operating in what we call substantial contribution. So that's in practice how you can think about the taxonomy. One of the criticisms I often hear is it's only telling you when a company is performing at the greenest possible level. I will use this diagram to say that's not necessarily true. So this is definitely a story of progress.
Nadia, this is a really critical understanding for everyone to get, isn't it? And in a sense, you've also outlined one of the ways we're using this term transition in organizations, which people are totally confused about out there, I have to say. You know, is transition, does it mean gas plants are good or whatever? The point about transition is you're moving, you're changing. You're becoming a greener or more sustainable, I should say, company. This is critical, isn't it?
I think so. And I think it is probably one of the most misunderstood pieces of the taxonomy when I do panel events. The thing I definitely get frequently asked questions on is, well, sustainability, it's always backward looking. It's always reported for the year after it's happened. The taxonomy is just a contributor to that. And I don't think that's true. So your obligation, just to go through it, and we're doing it a day before we actually know the rules. So we're expecting the European Commission to publish what's called the Article 8 Delegated Act. Now, what is that? That is going to tell you what you have to report, when you have to report it, and how you have to report it in a little bit more detail than you currently see in the taxonomy regulation. Unfortunately, Sean and I have no spoilers, so don't ask us. We don't know.
Come on, we must have a bit of gossip, Nadia. I can't believe this. But for everyone listening, tomorrow the Commission will announce the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance version 2, which includes, yes, the release of this Article 8 measure that Nadia is talking about. Can you just tell us, there's a lot of articles floating around, you know, we get lost in bureaucratic jargon. Article 8, Article 5, Article 6, what have we got to worry about here if we're a corporation?
So let's think about corporate in terms of non-financial counterparty, because corporate can mean both. So if we just scope it from a non-financial counterparty perspective, then actually one of the really pressing pieces of the taxonomy is this Article 8. And it tells you that you have to report your turnover, your capital expenditure, and or your operational expenditure associated to the taxonomy, similar to this example. You have to explain which of the 6 environmental objectives you're substantially contributing to. You need to attest that you do no significant harm to any other. And you
Sorry, Nadia, I just got to ask you that. You don't have to meet them all. You just have to meet one or another. Is that right?
Currently, that's the case, yes.
So we're waiting to see tomorrow?
We're waiting to see tomorrow whether it is all, but at the moment, yes, you would need to demonstrate that you substantially contribute, and to which, or to multiple. So perhaps you have an activity and you are substantially contributing to both mitigation and adaptation at this point in time.
That makes it a lot easier, doesn't it? So suddenly you don't have to you don't have to comply with everything. You pick the things you comply with, and I want to stress, we're not expecting any surprises out of tomorrow's announcement. You know, this has been discussed ad nauseum in various, events that Nadia has been consulting in and so on. So we don't know the final detail, but we're not expecting any major changes. But this is another critical piece of understanding, which should make a whole lot of people breathe a little bit more easily. Maybe Isabel can tell us whether that's true in a minute. Okay, sorry, I cut you off midstream, Nadia. My apologies, but really important points.
No, absolutely. And I'm pretty much done here. I think a lot of the kind of meat of this will come in the Q&A session anyway, Sean. So I'm happy to hand over to Isabel at this stage.
So Isabel, does that sound right? You've actually been doing this. You've done, is it 2, it must feel like 100 now, attempts to apply the taxonomy to the work of SPIE, one of France's largest firms. So tell us a little bit about your experience.
With pleasure. So we spell the company as SPI, by the way. Just
my apologies.
SPI. No problem. Some people say SPI. and so, yes, SPI has been performing its taxonomy assessment for 2 financial years now. We've started with the very first draft of the technical expert group from 2019. And we've updated our taxonomy alignment assessment last year with the draft TEG 2020 report. And now we are ready to start. We've just kicked off this morning our 3rd reporting campaign with the draft delegated acts. So. Indeed, we've gathered some experience in implementing the taxonomy in the company and bringing it down to the operational level.
And what did you find? I mean, was this, obviously the thing isn't finished yet, just still working, you've been working of a draft, but tell us about what it meant for you and how complicated it was. What was hard? What was easy? I'm hoping there were some things that were easy.
Well, first, no surprise. It is complicated, but it works well with great leadership commitment. So from the very beginning, we had our CEO, we had different members of the executive committee fully committed to drive this change management throughout the company. And the first year, this project was conducted within 4 months. So it was really high speed and challenging for the operational teams. we welcomed a lot. So why did we do that with a draft taxonomy? We were really welcoming this framework that would enable us for the first time to have a thermometer determining what is green from what isn't. And as you know, there are many companies in the corporate space which have elaborated their own framework to determine what are their green revenues. And SPIE had been resisting to do so for the lack of comparability from one company to the other. So we thought, okay, the taxonomy is getting traction, will get traction. Why not test it and use it from the beginning? And I think with retrospect and now starting this third campaign, it was great that we started early on, because it is not an easy process. At the very beginning, you deal with business development teams, you deal with operational teams who have never heard of those substantial contribution of those technical performance criteria. And you deal with data systems that have not captured such information. And so year after year, you can train your company and make sure that you reduce the estimation levels. There are activities, maybe if you could go back to the 90% of emissions covered, because we are dealing in multiple sectors at SPIE. So yes, the next one, exactly. There are activities for us at SPIE which are very, very easy to assess. For instance, the transmission and distribution services, the services to the grid. In 2019, we were able to qualify every revenue done in a country that had significantly decarbonized its electricity mix over the 5 last years. Mm-hmm. So it was excluding 1 or 2 countries in Central Europe for us, but validating all other European countries in which we work with. And in 2020, there was a new criteria saying that because the European grid is interconnected, even the grid service that you perform in a country like Poland should be qualified, because the electricity grid is a central part of our decarbonization strategy in Europe. So any T&D revenue is green by default. This is a very easy case for us in interconnected zones. That being said, the building sector for us is much more challenging. So when I was saying that data was not native in systems, when we work in renovation activities, we were not capturing whether the results was achieving more than 30% of energy savings in the given renovated building, for instance. So this is a habit that operations need to get.
So a big part of this is actually getting people used to collecting material data that hasn't been seen as being material in the past, but now there's a benefit or a requirement, is a better way to put it, I guess, to do so, to show off to investors and show off to others what it is in fact doing. Is it true that in this process you're kind of discovering how much you're contributing to the transition? Is that a side benefit of this, or is that something that was well understood before, really?
Well, the company has always claimed to be on the side of the solution. So we have a 71% eligibility to the current taxonomy. So
71%. That's
yes,
Nadia. That's pretty good, hey?
Yeah.
It's unusual. Okay.
Yeah, 71% eligibility and 41% alignment.
Okay.
So it's probably, I don't want to jump over Isabel, but Sean, to answer, so eligibility is often misunderstood. So eligibility can be quite high for a company that has no alignment. And so eligibility although it's expected this will be the first metric asked of corporates to report, is not necessarily a green indicator. You could be 100% eligible and 0% aligned in practice.
So it's like you could have an energy efficient buildings real estate trust. So you're not eligible, but how many of those buildings actually qualifies? That's what you mean, right?
Exactly.
However,
what I do can be tested. So I make something that is
But Isabel's
eligible.
alignment figure was still pretty high too, wasn't it?
Isabel's alignment figure is really impressive, definitely.
Well, my companies, yeah. And in fact, I've seen some time ago a study sponsored by the German Ministry of the Environment, a sustainable finance study that was showcasing an average estimated assessed performance of the Euro stocks at 2%. So indeed, the 41% sound great, and the company, I mean, our job is to sell energy efficiency to the clients, basically. So for many years, we were having such mottos on the side of the solution, but now we have criteria against which we can measure it. So we are really welcoming this. And the good thing as well, when you start such a journey, is that subsidiaries start to compete against each other, or you see the managers of one division criticizing the other one, saying, you have it too easy with your criteria. I mean, working in TNT, that's 100% green. How come? And others that start bragging or complaining. But in the end, there is this healthy competition that is happening internally to perform on this indicator, which we call at SPIE the green share.
This is enormously exciting, isn't it? It's fantastic. This is what we want to see happen. Everyone working to do better than the other, to get greener, more sustainable. But tell us about this green share. You've done a whole lot of internal communication program on green share. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes. As I mentioned to you, on the first year, we did it at a high speed. And if you show the next slide, it will show you the journey that we've achieved in 2 years, because this green share has become a key strategic indicator. So this is just.
So my apologies, I'm jumping ahead of myself. This one.
No, yeah, that's it. This is an extract from the communication of our full year results. So last March, and among the classic financial figures, you can see the fourth bullet point is the increase of our green share revenue. So in 2019, we had recorded a 35% alignment. And in the year after, it was 41%. And this makes the headlines, and this gets the whole C-suite really excited. But so having said that, it has to go down from the C-suite to the operational level. And if you are showing the next slide, it gives you example of communication materials that we are rolling out. So for instance, this French comic in our internal newsletter that we're rolling out to start to explain really to all employees what are the criteria that qualify our revenue as green. And so I'm not sure that everybody reads French, but I've taken another one as an English translation, for instance, on the renovation example. But if you look at the lighting example, which is on the right hand, we explain that as of today, we do qualify all relamping in LED lighting in buildings, in renovated buildings, in new buildings. However, we cannot qualify it as public lighting, for instance. This is typically to explain, well, don't worry. I mean, your activity is green. However, today it's not described by the EU taxonomy. And so these are the kind of messages that we are passing internally.
I was such a fan of French bande dessinée when I was younger, so it's great to see you using the medium like this. But I think the key point for corporations is internal communication is critically important to make this work. When people understand it, there will be, they expect to see a race to the top, a competition, which has been a really positive thing for you at SPE, hasn't it? These organizations committing each other to get better.
Yeah, it's really also a value proposition for our clients. The fact that we are having teams that gradually master the EU taxonomy, they're also able to have this discussion with their clients whenever, for instance, whenever they discuss energy performance contracting. Sometimes clients might be reluctant to do an energy performance contracting because it's kind of, well, they're not used to that. It seems more complicated from a first view, but you know, you can tell them if we're doing an energy performance contracting with clear performance objectives, then it's qualified as green, for instance. It will be seen as green as per the EU taxonomy.
And Nadia,
trouble exemplifying this.
Nadia, this is something that we haven't discussed enough in the past, isn't it? The extent to which this liberates other companies to qualify in a way they haven't qualified and maybe be seen as sustainable, and of course get access to sustainable financial instruments like green bonds and the like in this process. So we suddenly link the services of companies like SPE to the assets like buildings to other industries. Are you seeing other examples coming through that are interesting like this?
Yeah, Sean, I am, and I've been, while you've been chatting, I've been having a little nosy through the Q&A as well. We've got a really well-informed audience, so I might try and tackle a couple of those too, because they rightly pointed out that I didn't talk about operational expenditure. So I'll just spend a moment just talking about that, because I recognise that's a little bit of a nuance in people's brains, kind of how to appreciate OPEX in the context of the taxonomy. So the definition of and inclusion of OPEX actually relates to the necessary operational costs in maintaining or sustaining your taxonomy alignment, if you will. So it acts in complement to your capital expenditure, and ultimately to kind of view them together, particularly if you're an investor, there's an encouragement to view them together, is it's to give an indication of a company's strategy for maintaining or improving its environmental performance over time. And we recognize some companies classify that today as operational expenditure, and some companies today classify as capital expenditure. So the recommendations given at the moment very much align to existing accounting standards. In terms of your question on everything kind of complements each other, we've got a lot of questions coming through. Nadia, you said no to fashion, but what if I'm updating a warehouse? Good question. If you're updating a warehouse and you're generating through the update a 30% energy efficiency improvement, I love the abacus, Isabel, that's brilliant. If you're doing that, then the capital expenditure for updating may well be taxonomy aligned. And equally, to your point, Sean, you can raise debt to be able to do that and maybe issue bonds that are classified as taxonomy aligned use of proceeds. And as we've recently seen, potentially qualify under the green bond standard should you follow the verification processes. In terms of interconnectivity of the taxonomy, absolutely. There are a couple of questions in there about what if I use renewable energy? You know, is that good? It is. You don't get per se credit for the renewable energy, but you certainly do in some criteria. It looks at where you're using energy, that the energy you're consuming is below the 100-gram limit, as one maybe of multiple tests. So for example, in the manufacture of aluminium, I know that's one particular test. What you also start to look at is the carbon intensity of production processes. And sometimes within that, you're definitely looking at, if you buy renewables, your carbon intensity, particularly your scope 2, is going to be lower, and therefore you're going to have a more healthy carbon intensity metric relative to the KPI that taxonomy expects of you. In my simplified cement example, I didn't go into too much on do no significant harm. I know we had a question saying that's all well and good, but let's imagine you're not doing harm under the adaptation criteria. And look, I think that's a really relevant question. because actually adaptation is looking at, have you climate risk assessed your business? And have you started to take steps to really understand physical or transition-based risks upon your business and hopefully start to mitigate those, or at least have a plan to mitigate those? And I recognize there's not a lot of companies that have done that today. And so maybe one thing to start to think through is, if you've got capital expenditure or a project, and through that project, that maturity, you're going to meet those do no significant harm requirements, then yes, it can qualify. One of the things that is nuanced here is turnover. So at the moment, from a turnover perspective, you do need to demonstrate that you've done the do no significant harm steps. Unless anything changes tomorrow, Sean, that you and I aren't aware of, to say that your turnover is aligned, then you do need to demonstrate no harm to all environmental objectives.
But if we take the adaptation thing, a lot of people think this is abstract. This is now material. I mean, look what's just happened in Canada, where in places which are frankly known for being very, very cold, we've seen 45, 49 degrees centigrade Celsius temperatures in the last couple of weeks, climate change related, and consequent major impacts on businesses, on homes, on hotels, on the power system. In one case, sadly, a fire got set up and the town's been burnt out. Now, these become material risks. So when you're looking at adaptation, it's not about 30 years down the track. It's about preparing now. Will we have a drastic heat wave in Germany or in Hungary in the next weeks? Well, we actually had one last week. It wasn't quite 49, 50 degrees, but it wasn't pleasant. We had significant searing heat. Imagine that for an extra 10 degrees on top, which is now looking highly likely in the volatile weather. By the way, while we were having 49-degree temperatures in British Columbia last week, there was snow falling in southern Brazil. Snow in southern Brazil. So, we've got a few things we've got to start preparing for. So if you have assets, even in a warehouse, you need to make sure that you're covered for the kinds of things that can happen. Extreme flood risk, extreme heat. Now, there's an insurance aspect, sure. And the insurance companies are coming forward, but to disclose, it's reasonable to disclose to ensure you're sustainable. Have you taken steps to have a look? This is the point of it, right? So this is not rocket science. Isabel, was this challenging for you on the adaptation side of the question, the do no significant harm measures? Is that part of your mix? You've been through this twice now, haven't you? So you've had a lot of experience.
Yes, indeed. And I'll use also this opportunity to directly answer a question from the chat. The do no significant harm criteria and the social safeguards, for the moment, we've been doing them at consolidated level. And for climate change adaptation, climate adaptation plans, well, that's reporting against TCFD, which is becoming also the new normal, requires a company to have an adaptation plan and to disclose physical risks, transition risks, and the residual risk after mitigation. So yes, we didn't find, in fact, passing those tests did not, in our case, subtract any percentage of green revenue. But maybe that's also due to the fact that we only operate, or almost only operate, in Northern Europe, where environmental and social laws are well developed. And so basically we found out that respecting, by being compliant with the law, was sufficient to pass those do no significant harm criteria and social safeguards. This was not bringing us any difficulty. The difficulty was more on the auditing party side, because at first they did not really know how they would audit this new indicator and how far they should go, what type of proof trail they should be asking. As you might know, in France, the social and environmental performance information has to be audited by a third party. So I do hope that it will come tomorrow as well, because that would put us on a level playing field. But so such information, since it's a critical KPI for us, it's audited at site level, it's audited at group consolidated level, and auditors have to build their doctrine, I mean, their way of auditing this. And we are eager to see other companies publishing as well, to find a kind of interpretation jurisprudence, if I may say.
Good point.
Isabel, I think that's super, actually, because certainly a role of Sean and I in the platform is outreach, and that extends to auditors. This is new to them too, and so it does make me smile a lot when people are saying, "Oh, but is it audited, and therefore is it all good?" And you're like, "Well, auditors are going through the same learning journey as the corporates here, but we're certainly seeing them staff up in order to be able to adequately cope."
Isabel, I need to ask, because we're talking auditors, we're talking all this work, benefits. You said earlier when we were speaking, go early, get it wrong, and fix it. But which is, I think, good advice for everyone. But you also said something else, which I want to pick you up on, which you said you thought there was a transformational power. I think the words I wrote down in my notes anyway, about the application of the taxonomy going forward. Can you tell us a bit more what you mean?
Sure. So I've been in the sustainability field for 20 years now. And so I'm used to dealing with a broad community within a corporation involving many, but the taxonomy changes the landscape in a way that the people who need to respond to that are the ones that are in contact with the client, the business developers, business development teams, the operational teams. And so for the first time, this community gets very excited about environmental performance. It's not, checking the box or making sure you're ready for an ISO 14001 audit. It's much more transformational, because they see the value proposition that they can make out of that for their commercial landscape, and they've seen in parallel also this commercial landscape evolving anyway. So when I talk with some of my colleagues in facility management, for instance, many tell me a few years ago, it was rare that a client would ask me to provide them estimated CO2 savings. And now they want to discuss this before they discuss the price. So this is, they're taking this as an anchor to develop their skills in selling environmental performance, I think.
So Nadia, that's good news for us. The positive side. This is exactly what we're trying to get to. So it's not going to be a petrol car. That's what we're used to. That's what we've driven in the past. It will be an electric car, new for many of us, but it will still be a car, but it'll be new and improved and easy to drive once we get there. Of course, it looks complex at the moment. Nadia, I've had one comment in the chat. Your example was a bit too simplistic. What about if we're an organization that got 5,000 business lines? Tell us about that.
I read that one. I had sympathy for that organization. One thing I definitely want to commend Isabel, because we have to remember that when her organization produced their first taxonomy report, we didn't even have a final climate change mitigation or adaptation delegated act. But the data was put out there as, this is my proof of concept on my taxonomy alignment. And then I think the learning curve Isabel's explained for us in, governance and buy-in and engagement has been something that means at the point at which it's relevant, they're going to have got it right. And I've seen a ton of comments in going, what do I have to report? When do I have to report? Is it only eligible next year? Is it aligned kind of the year after? And my message, when you read the timeline, great. But my message is, listen to Isabel's story, because I think absolutely try and put some voluntary data together and say, at this stage, based on what I know, this is where I think my company is landing. And then I think, Sean, to answer the poor individual who's starting to work through 5,000 different activities. There's some recommendations that we provided in the technical, get my language right, technical expert group, the TEG, where we talked about this 5-step process. And I would encourage people to really go back to basics. So step 1, eligible revenue. I know my simple cement example, actually 100% of what I did was eligible. I was making cement, and that cement could therefore be tested. Now there are things called NACE codes, which is used as a nomenclature framework, and that allows you to capture the EU taxonomy eligible sectors. Not everybody uses NACE, and that's absolutely fine. In fact, NACE doesn't fully cover the EU taxonomy. So if you read in the Delegated Act, it actually explains that activity. If you don't know for eligibility, my recommendation is go a little broader. Like this thing I do, I'm making money from, and then thereafter I need to demonstrate my alignment. Your eligibility number is always going to be higher than your alignment number. So then the tricky bit comes into substantial contribution. There needs to be test criteria written in the technical annex. If there are not test criteria, you can't say that you're substantially contributing. You can't make it up and say, well, I'm better than my peer group, therefore I believe I'm substantially contributing. There are actual KPI, and quite a lot of them are very detailed in terms of what you have to do. Now, I think, Sean, we touched on this. You definitely hear criticisms that they're too tight. But like you said, climate change is real, and we do need to make some quite considerable changes. And yes, it's shocking the extent of changes we need to make from how we're operating today, and that is recognised. The next is this do no significant harm. Now, I recognise do no significant harm in the way that it's spelled out today really is like sitting an exam and getting an A. There's no credit for the B's and the C's of this world. So what do you need to do? And I think what it involves here is evidence on how you're conducting your do no significant harm. There may be limits, and I think there's a question in here about how deep do I go into my supply chain? What if my supply chain is very small operators and I can't get hold of that data? And I think for a period of time you can say that. Look, this is as far as I've been able to go. I've got open questions, but as far as I am aware, I am compliant, and here's my evidence as to how I'm compliant. And then finally, there was a couple of questions in there about minimum social safeguards. They've been around a while, actually. So minimum social safeguards really draws on pre-existing frameworks like the OECD multinational guidelines, the UN guiding principles, the 8 conventions of ILO. And actually, when you dig into them, I don't think there'll be any surprises there. Do you have anti-corruption and bribery policies? Do you have a human rights policy? You know, if you want to go a step further, are you regularly auditing your social side of your supply chain? You know, rarely do you yourself get involved in human trafficking and child labour, but could you inadvertently be doing that within your supply chain? And are you asking the right questions to uncover that fact? And again, minimum social safeguards, we recommend it as a due diligence process. This is what I've done. These are the policies I have to demonstrate what I'm doing, and therefore I am in compliance with these frameworks. And if you just start off on those basic steps, you can start to calculate your alignment. And so I would say to people, don't be too scared. Start the process off, get as far as you can get, and be open with your disclosure. There is the quantitative number and there's the qualitative description within the way that you're reporting. And so it does allow a little bit of freedom where data may not immediately be available to you and you need to work to improve it over time.
Isabel, have you got business outside of Europe as well as within Europe at SPE?
Very little. So about 3% of turnover outside of Europe.
And did you look at that as part of the mix?
Yeah, it was, the 41% is on 100% of the revenue. So we've been including everything from the very beginning. I hope it will be the case for all. It would make a more consistent comparison and assessment. So we applied the same rule as for all of other corporate social responsibility or financial indicators. They are applied on the totality of operations. And so the 3% outside of Europe anyway is not an eligible activity. So
Academic.
it made their life easy in a way.
So the key point is, someone's asked about whether the taxonomy applies outside of Europe. It applies to your activities that you're reporting in Europe. Now, of course, you can decide that your activities in Kenya or the US are not sustainable and not include them in reporting, but equally, you can include them if they qualify. As Isabel found they didn't, so it's a bit academic, but we've got that. Did I get that right, Mazel? You frowned, then I'm worried I got it wrong. But anyway, the main point is you can look at international activities. There are a few just basic points to mention around application. The taxonomy disclosure will apply for not only corporations, but all investors, large investors, and all banks. It will apply across the European Union. There are no countries that are exempt, as someone was asking about. It applies everywhere. It is not necessarily applying to all SMEs. There's some issues there. Nadia, perhaps you can explain, how does it work for the SME community?
Yeah, it's a good question. So at the moment, the taxonomy regulation defines itself in the scope of the non-financial reporting directive. Now, the non-financial reporting directive at the moment scopes itself to greater than 500 employees. Now, one thing kind of in the near horizon is something called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Now that lowers the threshold to 250. Now, because they're directives, the other thing I'll say is they're still subject to local legislation. So we've seen, for example, the 500 under NFRD. There are certain countries that have chosen to go lower at 250, and countries have the ability to do so. So stay close to your local legislation in terms of whether you scope in or out. So at the moment, if we say 250 employees or less is considered an SME in the context of the taxonomy, what do you have to do? Well, there's no mandatory reporting obligation yet. There is a clause that at 2025, the Commission will be reviewing SME reporting requirements. What you might find as an SME is you may choose to voluntarily report, and you're absolutely able to do so. You might find that there's more attractive financing available to you, and therefore you are engaging with your credit institution, and you may want to look at the construct of the debt and whether that debt itself is taxonomy aligned and therefore could claim credit that way. So there's still opportunities. I wouldn't say SMEs out of scope, ignore it. Certainly, as far as we're concerned, we're continuing to look at what this means and the challenges it presents that community as well. There is a difference between I employ 2 people and I employ 249 people. And so we're trying to kind of understand the nuance there and the guidance we should give that community.
Oh, fantastic. Good points. I've got a particular interesting example here, I thought, which is about real estate trusts and buildings, which is application of buildings criteria and so on. So if you're a corporation, you own a property portfolio, which could be if you're lending to a property portfolio too. How does this work? If I've got an old set of buildings and they don't meet the criteria, folks, they don't qualify. They're not energy efficient enough. But Nadia is giving you a potential get out of jail free pass, which is that if you're going to upgrade the buildings, you can bring it into that great chart, that great slide you showed earlier. You can improve your portfolio over time and disclose that, can't you, Nadia?
Yeah, absolutely. So we recognise new buildings have very tight criteria that, quite frankly, the older buildings are not going to be capable of meeting. But there is renovation as an activity under climate change mitigation, and that looks for the 30% energy improvements to be made. And that allows you to qualify. It also, and I think there's a question here, allows the construction company that you've commissioned to do that work for the revenue that they're making through your project to qualify. There is an interesting question in there saying, but what if I'm at the mercy of my end supply chain? And you see that as well. Like, what if my end customer wants a virgin plastic bottle and I therefore am only meeting their need rather than using renewable as source material? And there are concerns in terms of the value chain and kind of the push-pull factor on you. I think that's certainly something we want to look at in terms of the completeness of the taxonomy. I think, as you'd mentioned, Sean, it's still in design. We're still working through that.
But I'm going to pick up on that one, because at the end of the day, we have an extraordinary environmental challenge before us. We have to get emissions down in Europe by 50% by 2030. That's the official European target now. which has been adopted by the Parliament and so on. Now, and it may have to be tougher than that. So there's stuff we have to do, not to mention our other environmental challenges. So I'm going to say, if you do have a customer like that in your supply chain is insisting on plastic bottles, you also have a role as a European citizen, as someone helping to create a better Europe, to educate them about what we need to do here. If we can meet their needs in another way, which is more environmentally sustainable, this is of course what SPE do all the time in their business, then we should do it. We've got to do it. And we look at the advantages of going here. And just the property sector, it's not just the improvement, the retrofit cost you can count, but you can also count the whole building in the way we've constructed taxonomy. If your building is in the top 15% of energy performers in Germany or Bulgaria or Sweden, that building counts as sustainable for reporting the whole value. So the retrofit to get it up there, or the retrofit to get to EPC F or to EPC B. But if you fit from the top level, then the whole building can qualify. But bearing in mind, it'll get tougher. So every 3 years, it'll get tougher and tougher and tougher. So by 2050, we want the whole of the building stock in Europe to be effectively net zero carbon. That's a transition trajectory, if you want. The goalposts will move in a consistent, predictable fashion to try and push the industry sideways. So there's a hell of a lot you can do. And if you're not looking at that in the property business, you should have a closer look. So if you've got an old portfolio, you transform. You'll get time to transform, but you will need to transform. And frankly, you're not going to get tenants in a few years' time, the way things are going, because who wants to pay a whole lot of energy bills and live with the opprobrium of having a really energy inefficient building, Isabel? Don't you think?
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, I'm glad I've heard you mentioning that those criteria would be updated every 3 years. This is something that we are eager to. I mean, we're eager to have an idea of the frequency at which they will be updated, and I would assume that it also depends on the legislative packages of the EU. So, for instance, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive shall be updated this year. So, in a few months from now, those criteria should certainly evolve. And by the way, the criteria on new buildings is rather less demanding in the final delegated acts than last year.
I'm so glad you said that. Nadia and I were part of the group that drafted the buildings taxonomy. They are a little less demanding than we expected for new buildings. Mm-hmm. But I want to stress, one of the roles of the EU platform is to continue to advise on development of what is a dynamic tool. We do have a commitment that in transition sectors, such as buildings, there will be a review every 3 years, and the absolute intent is to continue to toughen those as we go forward. And the building sector, in the technical expert group report, we had a long discussion about this. So that will improve. It becomes a hard energy-related measure or possibly an emissions-related measure, and that then ratchets down. And that's a key point about transitions. Now, ideally, we would shift the whole economy to zero carbon tomorrow. That's frankly what the scientists are telling us what we should do. But we recognize it's pretty tough. But we are looking at transitions that are commensurate with the ambition we need to achieve to get the Paris Climate Change Agreement targets met. And that's the wiggle room. Some areas it's still difficult. Someone's pointed out that agri is not yet in the taxonomy. Correct. It became muy complicado. And so we've now delayed it, or rather the Commission has delayed it to a little bit later as the negotiations, the discussions are still underway. Some areas, we've seen some relaxing of standards in some of the land use areas, and there have been some NGOs highly critical of that, understandably in my view. But I want to stress that in the key CapEx areas, the ambition remains in energy, in property, in transport, in waste and water. We have the ambition, which is absolutely in line with Europe's targets, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is, of course, the whole intent of a science-based taxonomy. But yeah, we will learn as we go. A bit like what you were saying, Isabel, get going, learn as you go, get some things wrong, fix them. That's how we're going to work on the platform as well. We've had a whole lot of questions. I want to try and tackle a few. And Sylvester Becker, yes, we are actually answering questions as we go case you didn't notice. Please ask some more for us so we can answer them. We're not going to get to all the questions, but can I throw a couple at you? Sorry, I've got to. You've been looking at them too. CapEx and 3-year reviews. If people are putting a forward CapEx plan for 5 years, let's say, and we don't know what the 3-year review in that sector is going to be, let's say steel and so on, how do we reconcile this potential uncertainty around forward targets versus what we're disclosing now as sustainable? Nadia?
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, actually, Sean, and one we've also highlighted is the need for trajectories. So you'd mentioned things, even things like the EU ETS, which I mentioned earlier, itself has review periods and continues to tighten over certain periodicity. Now, that is a problem if you've got capital expenditure plans. What we're saying at the moment is definitely at outset, at maturity of that project, you should be meeting those technical screening criteria. There may need to be a review of something like a grandfathering provision, for example. Now, we don't know the details of that, but that might be required such that you've got certainty at the point at which you're planning that capital expenditure and project to know that as long as you've achieved that target, at the point at which you started the project for maturity, that you can say, well, this is where I'm aiming to, and I've achieved that. Now, if the goalposts have moved, now you've got to start to consider, because if the goalposts have moved, potentially you can't claim revenue from that process. And that is a problem. So the quicker we can get to known trajectories, the better. I think climate science is still evolving, and we're certainly working to provide kind of better alignment. You can see certain tools out there to the financial community, things like the new benchmark regulation that look at climate transition and Paris aligned and expect a certain decarbonising level. And it would be really interesting to start to see that sort of thing, a kind of clear pathway emerge so that people have certainty. I think that's important.
And that's one of the things we're still working on. I'm going to say, I don't think we finalised that discussion, but wherever possible, we are doing it. The main thing you need to know is this is about climate change ambition commensurate with Europe's commitments and the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Now, that does force us to confront some things now and then. I mean, to take in the electricity industry, we have a bit of a fight going on at the moment between some member states and the Commission and other member states around things like gas. Sort of CCGT plant be counted as transition. The difficulty is that according to the IPCC 2018 report and the International Energy Agency's net zero report of a few weeks ago, which is about meeting the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the transition we have to achieve in the energy sector is actually way steeper than anyone's been figuring. And what that means is we can't afford, in the words of Fatih Birol, the executive chair of the International Energy Agency, we can't afford to have any new fossil fuel investments to meet our targets. And that makes life difficult. Now, that's excluding fossil fuel or carbon capture and sequestration and so on. In other words, anything that meets the technology agnostic threshold of 100 grams would qualify. But this is confronting because every country in the world has had a climate change plan based on what I'm going to call 2015, 2010 thinking. Unfortunately, we haven't done very well over the last 30 years. Emissions have continued to go through the roof. So as a result, the reduction is much, much tougher than we experience. And this is one of the things that taxonomy is flushing out. Because we've identified urgency in different sector, it's forcing us to confront the ambition or the relative lack of ambition we've had before, and we've got to rethink. So it will be hard in some areas. But the other side of this, of course, is that if we shift capital, and remember, we have more than enough capital. We have capital buried in areas earning negative interest rates in German bunds and Swedish bonds at the moment that needs to go somewhere where it can earn a revenue. We've got capital. If we direct it accordingly, we can fund all this sort of stuff and it can be part of a growth story, or as the Commission likes to say, build back better. So that's the background to it. Other questions you spotted, Isabel or Nadia, dive in. Does it link to the Sustainable Development Goals? It's not strictly speaking an answer to corporate, but I will say, yes, there will be some mapping. Of course, addresses climate change, and you'll see more of that as we go along. What's the process for new activities? The EU platform has a continual job of reviewing it. We are currently about to promote frameworks for social and significant harm measures next week, And we're working on circular economy, pollution prevention, and other areas that we will release later in this month for consultation over the summer into the early September. So watch this space. And then, of course, next year, we'll have a new crop. Every year, we'll be doing more. We do currently cover, well, 80% of the European economy, if exclude agri. Agri will be coming in separately soon. So it's a pretty large chunk, but we do want to get into the high 90s by the time we're finished. Okay, if I have a company that only has 20% green or sustainable activities now, how thorough does the planning have to be? Ambition versus CapEx plans, and who's going to supervise? Who's going to make sure I deliver? How does that work over the next few years, Nadia? Going back to your earlier point about the get out of jail free card, you can look forward.
Asking me a difficult supervisory question. I don't know that I'm necessarily qualified to say like who comes and slaps you with a fine. I think there's a kind of social conscience here. Certainly the taxonomy, I think, is designed to be more carrots than stick. Is probably the way I would answer that question, Sean, rather than get into the nuts and bolts of who tells you off if you get your numbers wrong. Certainly there is a big piece of the taxonomy we haven't spoken about, which is obligations placed on financial market participants, and also obligations for the way that they market products that they're calling ESG or pursuing environmental goals. And the view here is that over time, if you are doing the right thing, your cost of capital will reduce. There is a natural incentive here for you to either structure debt around projects or start to operate in a way where your equity becomes attractive, because then what will happen is the financial products which are claiming ESG characteristics, and it's even cleverer than that, if I'm honest. So they've started to lean on pieces of legislation like MiFID suitability, which in the olden days, Sean, if you and I had a conversation and let's say that I'm your asset manager to your vast wealth, and previously you'd have to come to me and say, Nadia, I have these ESG preferences. What's happening now is I have to go to you and say, Sean, what are your ESG preferences? And ultimately, I then have to explain them using the taxonomy. So the ESG quality of that product actually has a numerical value associated to it, looking at the underlying investee companies. So for the corporates that we're speaking to today, there are actually incentives at a place already where people are saying, yes, I do want ESG preferences. I think there was a recent poll that I read, just a consumer kind of stop on the street survey, that indicated between 60 and 70% of people stopped who were directly asked whether they had ESG, so environmental, social or governance preferences in terms of investment, answered, yes, I do. Actually, I do. And we don't see that at the moment. We don't see 60 or 70% of financial products structured with an ESG tilt to them. So that's going to change. And as a result of that, the companies that are doing the right thing here are going to become more attractive. So it's really an influence through capital markets that I think is interesting. You made another good point, like the world is changing, and you know the resources we have relied on thus far are no longer free, and we need to take responsibility here. And it's not been good enough to kind of draw on the social conscience of people. We need KPI, we need rules, we need to have clarity in what it takes to be able to stick to them. And I think it's a really important time now to kind of move forward. And I'm really proud of the fact that Europe is the lead here, that we can't ignore the fact that there's also, under climate adaptation, you've touched upon it, the need to climate risk assess businesses. And what we're also seeing is there's requirements around climate risk assessment and making sure that everybody has thought about this in terms of the operation of their business, but also financial markets, starting to really push that stress testing has to involve climate risk scenarios as well. So it's definitely what I think as the very beginnings of a very large wave. And whilst I think for a small collection of us, it feels like we're already on the crest, I don't think we are. So I think there's still kind of more to go. And to your point, and the criticisms that I often hear is, but I don't have the data, I don't collect the data, I don't measure it yet, there's not enough for me to rely on. We have to look to the future. We have to look at our responsibility to start measuring these things, to start to collect the data, to start to disclose it in a way that's useful and relevant to anybody who may be choosing to use that data. financial market participants being one. So I'm very much, I'll finish my monologue and let Isabel speak, but from my perspective, that would be the answer to that question, Sean.
Great point, Nadia. Isabel, did you want to come in at all on that point?
Nothing better to add than what Nadia said. I was responding in parallel to one question on the spillover effects, and because I want to make clear that, okay, we are a mid-cap. We have about 45,000 employees and make 7 billion of revenues approximately. But we work for we work for the entire economy, a little bit like a bank, but we deliver energy efficiency services or telecommunication services. And we have very small clients everywhere. So, I mean, we have a mix, but we do have a wealth of clients, and among them SMEs or small city halls. And so one of the benefits is that for us wanting to perform to perform on the taxonomy requires getting information and discussing environmental performance with those clients, because otherwise we will struggle to reduce those estimation levels, and we will not have the right amount, the right type of data to prove our taxonomy alignment in the future. So,
indeed, I mean, I think every company's got this same kind of thing, and it's worth noting, by the way, everyone, that the data providers in the financial services sector, like Bloomberg and Refinitiv, looking at a whole lot of work providing data. We expect data to be pouring out of our ears next year, this time next year. There are so many people looking to see how they can support it within their existing lines of businesses. And frankly, if you're not getting hold of data, or sorry, not providing the data that investors are asking for at the top of the food chain, then you may just be shut out. So what SPI's done is getting ahead of the curve and starting to prepare the presentation for their investors, as well as the regulator and others. And everyone's going to do this. The question is how you can do it efficiently. Now, so if you feel like you don't know where to start, very understandable. I don't know where to start half the time. But what we know is everyone's in the same position, and all the service providers, you're going to be getting brochures through your letterbox in the front door soon saying, here you go, data solutions for you. So bear that in mind. It's an industrial ecosystem change. We're now in the middle and trying to drive forward. It's not just something on your organization and your company. And if it was just that, it would be impossible. But it's everywhere, including member states and the Commission. And this is the good thing to be part of, with the prize of comparability, the prize of understanding what we're doing that's right and that's wrong. When, remember, for the last 30 years, we have continued to put more emissions in the atmosphere than the previous 150 years. While we've been talking about climate change, we've got worse, not better. So we're kind of going to try something a bit fresh here. And this is fresh, linked, of course, to really robust targets, not just in Europe. It's not Europe just sticking its neck out here. The UK is committed to 68% reduction. The US is committed to 50% reduction. China has committed to, in their case, peak by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060, and so on, and Japan and Korea. So this is a post-pandemic change in the global direction of what we're doing. But of course, it's still going to come down, Isabel, to what an individual enterprise has to do. So I want to ask you one last question to take us out, and then Nadia can have the final word. In the map of how difficult it was and the benefits you see coming forward, what's your reflection? You've been through this a few times. Clearly, it's been challenging to get it done. But what's the the cost-benefit ratio looking like to you at this moment, this particular snapshot in time?
Well, for a company like us, the benefit has been tremendous and really, outpacing the costs and efforts. Now my business development colleagues will kill me for saying that, because they are bearing the burden of data collection and they are struggling. They will still struggle a couple of years. but they do find value in that. And certainly in the investor space, this has allowed a mid-cap like us to be identified as green, and without, I mean, also to have very interesting discussions with our investors on the taxonomy. They all want to know how we've done it.
So they're asking you now?
Yes, they're asking us. I mean, it's in every ESG investor conversation that we have, for sure. And yeah, they want always to know more about what's coming next, the business strategy. It has given us a great structure for every business line to reflect upon their strategy, in fact. And the other benefit that we see, we are in an industry that is sometimes struggling for shortages in skills. So it is also helping the company to position its employer branding in a consistent way and to attract new profiles.
Thank you. Thank you. Nadia, a last word.
I don't think I should take the last word. I think Isabel's message is a powerful one, which is go early. I mean, don't continue to wait until you're told to do so. I think the power of it could be a struggle. Let's organize ourselves around it. And then secondly, the benefits that I think Isabel firsthand is telling you about speaks volumes to give this a go. Try and be here with the taxonomy. Sean and I will be here in many panels, I'm sure, to come, explaining to you in more and more detail how to do this. And we will try and produce as much material as we can do to make usability less of a struggle and less of a burden upon you. But definitely give it a go. I think that would be my final message here to the corporates on the line.
Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Isabel, for having joined us today to talk about what it means for corporations, the taxonomy. Thank you, everyone, for being on the call today. I'm sorry we haven't been able to answer all your questions. We will attempt to answer a few of them by text going forward. Next week, we will have the presentation of the social taxonomy in a 2-hour session with Antje and Nadia from the platform talking about what it means and what the framework looks like. The day after, Nancy Sage and Nathan Fabian will talk about the significant harm taxonomy. The week after, we'll come back to this series to talk about what it means for banks. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube. I'm expecting tomorrow. If there's any doubt about that, come back tomorrow evening rather than tomorrow morning. The main thing is we've just tried to involve you in a discussion about how it goes. There will be now formal materials coming out later in the year. The closer we get the deadline, guidance for how the taxonomy works. The European Commission and the EU platform will be working on that. But as you can see, it's interesting, it's fascinating. It's a little bit of a roller coaster ride, but Isabel said it so beautifully, clearly about the benefits of what we're doing. Thank you again for joining us. And thank you so much, everyone, for being keen, for being enthusiastic, for being willing to work to create the sustainable future we need, both sustainable returns and a sustainable world for our children. Good luck making it happen.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.